Good morning. It's the 24th of July, and you're watching this special edition of Europe Today about the EU-China summit underway in Beijing. There was hope that this summit would mark a fresh start and that an unpredictable President Trump would help rekindle the flame between Brussels and Beijing. But tensions have escalated, meaning expectations for this summit are rock bottom. Presidents von der Leyen and Costa are meeting Xi Jinping with a long list of complaints, from China's chokehold on critical materials to its glut of cheap exports. For more on what's at stake, our correspondent Shauna Murray joins me now. Good morning, Shauna. Tell me, what are officials in Brussels telling you about their expectations for this Beijing summit?
Well, we know the EU has been trying to have a constructive, conclusive conversation with China over what the EU would see as predatory market practices from China. Over the last few years, they've been trying to have this conversation, and this summit was another attempt to do that. But speaking to officials over the past few weeks, the expectations for anything substantial are actually quite low. Chief among the issues, of course, is Chinese subsidies to electric vehicles, which come into the European market and undercut the EU's auto industry. Another issue the EU has with China is, of course, these export controls on rare earth minerals, which are crucial for industries across the board, the automotive industry, semiconductors, the defence industry. We know the EU has its 2030 readiness targets for defence, which may be hampered if these export controls continue. And chief among them again, Mared, is of course the EU and NATO's position that China is the chief enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. Mared?
And on that, Shauna, is it fair to say that the relationship will always be stalled as long as China refuses to condemn Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine?
Well, you can imagine it will be stalled, Mared, because it seems impossible that China and the EU can have a reliable, trusting partnership if China refuses to condemn Russia's war in Ukraine, because it impacts not just Ukraine, but the whole of the European continent. But if you look at the facts on the ground, China is Russia's #1 purchaser of Russian crude oil, which funds the war in Ukraine. It also supplies Russia with 80% of its dual-use goods. That's products that can be used in consumer items, as well as heavy weapons that are found on the battlefield. But finally, it also said that the Americans have said that they will apply secondary sanctions against China for its purchasing of Russian oil if Moscow doesn't sit down at the table and agree a peace deal, a ceasefire with Ukraine in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Shauna, for bringing us up to speed there. Now, earlier I spoke to the former president of the European Commission, Jose Barroso, and started by asking him if he saw any hope that this summit could reinvigorate EU-China ties.
It will be the 50th anniversary of relations, diplomatic relations between the European Union and China. So in principle, it should be something strong, positive, forward-looking. But frankly, at the moment we speak, with the information I have, I don't see that happening. I see a lot of tension, some frictions, important frictions. So I'm sure there will be attempts on both sides to control the message and so to avoid negative things. But I don't expect this summit to be the forward-looking commemorative moment that in principle we would like to see.
You said as far back as 2012 that the EU ran the risk of irrelevance in between global giants like China and the US. Has the EU reached that point of irrelevance? Does it have any cards to play in Beijing?
These concerns remain. In fact, the concerns I expressed back many years ago. But I will not say that we don't have cards as Europeans. I think, in fact, Europe remains a very important power when we are together. When we have the European scale, there is a lot of leverage the European Union has. And not only in terms of trade and investment, where the European Union continues to be, if not the first one of the two most important global players, but in terms of diplomatic influence as well. As I said many times before, Europe should not be a kind of a geopolitical teenager. We have to become adults to be responsible for our own futures.
But President Barroso, do you agree with von der Leyen's hawkish approach towards China? Is it the right one at this moment?
The reality is that there has been a lot of frustration on the European side because of some policies of China, not only in trade, matters that we, in fact, have big friction there, but also politically. In Europe, there is a very understandable frustration with the fact that China, although presenting their position always as neutral between Russia and Ukraine, in fact, is clearly with Russia. The so-called friendship without limits with Russia. There's a strategic convergence against what we used to call the West. Traditionally, China has been always saying they are for multilateral order, that they are for the respect of international law. And now, in a case that is the most evident case of the last decades of a clear violation of international law, it's the biggest country in the world, Russia, invading its neighbor, taking parts of its territory. China is not able to say just a single word of criticism to Russia. This is, of course, very difficult for the Europeans to accept. So let's be pragmatic, but with principled pragmatism. It does not mean that we don't speak about our differences with China.
Finally, President Barroso, President von der Leyen has been warning of a new China shock, similar to the one we saw in 2001 when China joined the WTO. Do you agree with her assessment, and what can Europe do to protect itself?
My opinion is that China potential continues to be there. China will continue to grow, probably not at the same rate as before, because now it's a more mature economy, but their resources, including human resources, intellectual resources, technological resources, are really amazing. But for me, and that's very important, instead of criticizing others, what we have to do is our own homework. It's not because of China, or not because of the United States, that Europe has not yet completed its internal market on services. It's not because of China or the United States that Europe has not a capital market union and will continue to go on with 27 different markets. But I insist, this should be a wake-up call for Europe to do its own homework instead of putting the blame on others. And of course, we have to manage and navigate some differences, but still being able to do our own homework. That's the first thing if we want to be successful.
President Barroso, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was President Barroso speaking to Europe Today. Now, a major concern for the EU is China's restrictions on the export of critical raw materials. But there are also worries that the European Commission is operating in secrecy as it races to reduce its reliance on China. My colleague Eleonora Vasquez has this story, voiced by Jessie Dimich-Louvet.
The European Commission is being secretive and not consulting properly in its scramble to approve projects to mine critical raw materials, according to 4 Green MEPs. The MEPs claim the Commission rebuffed requests for information about mining of critical raw materials. They told Euronews that they are mulling legal action against the Commission. Last year, a new Critical Raw Materials Act empowered the EU to push for new mining projects. These critical materials are needed as components for electric vehicles and other clean tech products. The EU is trying to reduce its dependency on single suppliers such as China, which is the world leader in raw materials production. The MEPs quizzed the Commission on 6 projects ranging from Spain to New Caledonia, which they feared were being rushed through over local concerns, asking to see what assessments had been done. MEPs Maria Oysalo, Sarah Mathieu, and Margarine Spy, and Anna Miranda criticized the Commission for failing to respond properly, claiming one response offered earlier this year was generic and evasive. The European Commission had not replied to a request by Euronews for comment up to now.
That was Eleonora Vasquez reporting there for this special edition of Europe Today about the EU-China summit underway in Beijing. Now, you might be wondering why EU-China trade tensions have escalated so much in recent months. Euronews' Alessio Delana has this explainer.
Council President Antonio Costa and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have the monumental task of laying the groundwork to defuse a trade war with China, which has exacerbated an already massive trade deficit for the EU. The big issue on the table is China's state subsidies. Beijing has been accused of boosting domestic production through tax breaks, grants and cheap loans, flooding and disrupting global markets with low-priced goods. Europe has been severely undercut, particularly in the green sector, which the EU has the ambition to lead. The bloc's response was to slap hefty tariffs on China's electric vehicles to offset the effect of state aid. Beijing hit back by launching investigations into EU exports of brandy, dairy and pork. China also retaliated after the EU banned Chinese medical equipment suppliers from participating in public tenders exceeding 5 million euros. Regulations preventing European companies from accessing China pose another issue. The market is now all the more valuable as America is taking a more protectionist approach. As EU businesses remain on the edge, how much more trade turmoil can the bloc handle?
That's all from us today, but we'll be back tomorrow morning with reactions to the outcome of the EU-China summit. In the meantime, stay up to date with all our coverage on Euronews and Euronews.com.